I just wanted to, I was, very emotional, Jennifer, that you're joining us in the swamp, and really want to say that we appreciate your practice, we appreciate your research, and we appreciate your presence. Yeah, so without long ado, please join me in welcoming Jennifer Gabrys.
Well, thanks very much for that.
Sorry?
Can you hear me?
Not yet?
Oh.
Now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for that generous invitation. And it's great to continue the conversation about swamps and all things swampy. I'm actually going to include just a small slice of the work from Iceland, because I think it relates very much to the work I'm going to show today. So I'm going to talk primarily about Toolkit that we've made in London, and I have some examples of it here if you want to take some away. And I'm just going to set the stage a little bit by talking about sensing and sensors, how that relates to more than human organisms, and also how that might shift how we think about environments and environmental inhabitation. So I don't really have an intensive discussion of swamps, although I think you've had quite rich and interesting discussions of swamps and lagoons in detail. But one of the things that I really want to draw out about swamps is it's not just about the subsurface or the surface even, the kind of terra firma or infirma, but it's also about the miasma that swamps give off. So thinking about the muddy swamp as something that actually we fully inhabit also as an atmospheric phenomenon. So I'm going to talk today about air pollution. London is obviously a bit of a swamp topographically, but I would also say it's a swamp in terms of its air and air quality. So we could think about the miasma as part of the qualities of a swamp. And I did have to put a small slide, a short slide in here, also of the swamp thing. I found this for Lorena. We were talking with Gabrys last night about the swamp thing. Were you the one who didn't know about the swamp thing? We were talking about last night. Yeah. Anyway, I found this swamp thing, and just keep in mind the swamp thing is also this particular kind of entity that forms with and through plants, maybe even remaking masculinity in this case. So thinking about how we become plants is part of what I'll look at in this talk. But I want to just kind of bookend this on the other side by talking briefly about environmental sensing as part of a larger project that I've been doing called Citizen Sense, and there's some flyers explaining that over here for you to take away as well. And one of the things I've been looking at is how computational devices of all sorts are proliferating in environments. And these are ways to sense environments and also to automate environments and to create different kinds of operations, such as automated transport, automated flood control. Perhaps Venice would think about how it becomes a smart lagoon and remakes itself with these various infrastructures that could be computationally oriented. So part of the project is to look at these sort of critically and technically in terms of how they operate, but it's primarily looking at how people are taking up sensors and creating their own DIY sensors to monitor environments, particularly air quality, and then what they do with that data, with that evidence, and how they potentially create different kinds of environments. So what you're seeing today is the third aspect of the work, which is the wild sensing work, which is trying to think not just about computational devices, but also how they remake relations with organisms. So that research really has a long trajectory for me. I did some field work at an ecological study site in California as part of the University of California Reserve System, and they were creating what was a kind of wired woods. They were calling it, here's an illustration from an illustrator they hired, where they imagined this forest scene that would be completely instrumented with different kinds of sensors, webcams, soil sensors, all kinds of carbon dioxide sensors and so on. So here you can see a bit of detail about this. And I found this quite captivating in the way that it was not only sensing nature, but remaking environments and remaking our relations and experiences with those environments. So I did that research over 10 years ago now. In that study site, you can see here one of the test beds that they have in place to do sensing, as well as a weather station, and other kinds of sensors, for instance, to measure tree sap flow. So starting to sense other organisms, not just to understand how is that sap flowing up and down the tree, but what does that tell us about broader ecologies? So one particular sensor installation that I thought did that particularly well was what was called a MOSCAM. And this was a web camera as well as an infrared camera and the weather station, which is just behind inside of the frame here. And it's trained on this granite boulder. It's covered with moss. And the idea here is just to look at the moss 24/7 and to see how it changes, how it dries out, who visits the moss. As they found out as new scientific discovery, chipmunks like to visit moss and do various things there. But what they're then able to understand is things about climate change, for instance, because the moss is itself also a sensor. So this isn't just a sensor sensing moss. It's looking at how moss is taking up environments and sensing moisture levels, sensing carbon dioxide levels, and basically giving us an indication of what's going on in environments currently and also over time, because this data set is then stored up and it's studied by scientists, and it's a way to look at images as data. So I found this as a very particular and interesting stepping off point for thinking not just about sensors as computational sensors, but also as organismal sensors, as more than human sensors. And I think the swamp, in its many manifestations, as we've discussed, is a kind of environmental sensor. It's telling us all kinds of things about our environments, and we could slice into that in many different ways. So I'm not going to say too much more about that, except just to mention that I've written about that MOSCAM and that boulder in much more detail in this book if you're interested, and as well I've written about the forest, the sensing experimental forest in that book. So I just want to turn now to think more about this question of plant sensing, vegetation sensing, what I'm calling phyto-sensing. And I really started to focus in on this work vis-a-vis the visit I did in Iceland, in Reykjavik, with zoetics, and thinking about another kind of organism that's not technically a plant, and that's lichens. And lichens, if you can see the text here, lichens are most sensitive. So here's a text from some field work I was doing in the Arctic, up at a biological field station, and there were all kinds of samples of lichens and moss. But lichens have this ability to absorb their environments and serve as indicators of various kinds of events, especially pollution and especially air pollution. So there's some lichens that you can study, for instance, specifically for their ability to indicate whether there's pollution or not, and in what gradients. So I think this is quite interesting research to think about when we're also thinking about computational sensors and the ways in which they tune us into our environments. So some of this research is actually quite long-standing, and it also, I guess, provides a different way of thinking about environments, not just as numerical data. We're not just measuring, say, air pollution levels, but it's considered a kind of qualitative method where you can understand things like biodiversity, different kinds of environmental relations. This term I specifically like, which is phyto-sociological and or other treatments, so thinking about the sociological in a kind of phyto way. And you can map out ecological zones. It's kind of interesting board there for creating a lichen sensor, where you can get a sense of how this scientific technique is being played out. So what happened when people started doing lichen sensing, which I'll say a bit more about in a second, but started really in a formalized way in the mid-19th century, is they created an index, and they were able to tell, based on the presence of different lichens in different places, how poor the air quality would be. Typically in industrial sites, for instance, where there would be high levels of sulfur dioxide emissions, there were very few lichens. And farther away from these sites, there would be more lichens and a greater diversity of lichens. So these things started to be mapped out, and there were really sort of regularized relationships sort of identified and established that other people could use then to go out and look at how lichens would be sensors of the relative air quality in an area. So this particular study taking place in England and Wales. And this continues to be an interesting technique that's used not just to study air quality, but then to study relationships. So this is a study done in the late 90s, which was published in Nature, and it was done by actually some Italian scientists in an area in Milan, and they were looking at lichen diversity, and then how that also related to lung cancer mortality in young men. It's hard to kind of create this relationship for older people because they have all kinds of comorbidities that might create problems with lung cancer. But with young men, where you wouldn't expect to see lung cancer, here there was a just striking parallel between the lichen diversity and the presence of lung cancer. So there was greater diversity in the green, there were fewer cases of lung cancer, and where there was fewer lichens, there was greater incidence of lung cancer. So again, not just reading air pollution, but importantly reading the relationships that are environmental relationships. So lichens tune us in not just to the fact that the air quality is bad, but how it accumulates over time and how it affects our health and how it affects really everything that has to do with our environmental conditions. So, as I mentioned, this is part of a kind of longer standing trend then to look at how plants can be things that tell us particular things about environments. Here's the particular study that led to this sort of, I guess, formalized approach to studying lichens from William Nylander, who's a Finnish scientist living in Paris, and he did a study in the gardens in Paris, and he called lichens hygrometers. They were a particular kind of measurement system that would allow us to understand air quality, and we could look at them in this regularized way. So as I mentioned, this continues to be used, particularly in instances, say here, where you can note the relative sort of diversity or air quality based on whether lichens are growing on trees, they're called epiphytes, and so on. So I'm not going to say too much more about lichens, except to say that that was a sort of entry point for me then to think more closely about how to approach plants as sensors within an urban environment in relation to urban air quality. So this particular project, Phyto-Sensor, was undertaken with the Museum of London in London, and it was done through a Mayor of London low emission neighbourhood scheme, where they provided neighbourhoods with funds to look at ways of addressing air quality. So one of the things that we did was started to look at how to create a demonstrator garden of air pollution plants that would, on the one hand, bioindicate, as I've shown with lichens, through changes in their physiology or morphology or presence and distribution, air pollution or not. And then on the other hand, plants that might also mitigate air pollution. There are a number of plants that actually can, such as this yew here, Taxus baccata, that can trap air pollution particles. Particulate matter is of particular concern for human health, since it can get into your lungs and bloodstream and brain. So plants like the yew and the Pinus muto and so on, the dwarf pine, are plants that can capture particles on their needles, and other plants can do this through having hairy surfaces and so on. So we were looking at how to create a demonstrator garden using some of these plants. So what I did is I researched and advised on plants for this demonstrator garden, as well as installed some air quality monitor kits that we developed as part of the Citizen Sense project. And I'm not going to say too much about this today, because this is quite a long project. It's been going for almost 6 years now. But just to say that we made our own particle sensors called the dust box. And this senses PM 2.5, and the particular shape is in the form of particles when they're viewed under an electron microscope. And they're 3D printed and then cast in matte ceramic, you can see here. So we have a whole set of these, and we've set up air quality monitoring infrastructures in London, including in South London, where we found there were really quite high levels of pollution there using this monitoring infrastructure. So then what we did was, what I did in this case was set up these dust boxes along with the official air quality monitoring network here at Beach Street at the BARBERS to see how the pollution levels were comparing, and then how that might also help us think about an air pollution garden and what we might develop and plant in this area. So this is just the sort of setting up of several dust boxes around the pollution garden site. So you can see if you're familiar with the BARBERS, it's the tunnel area that goes under the BARBERS, and the BARBERS station is just at the end there. So then we made this demonstrator garden. Sorry, some of the plants are actually not in full flowering because these images were taken in December and January and on to March. But you can see the dust box set up there in this garden. And so we started to look at these relationships between what the computational sensors were sensing and also what the plants were doing as part of their mitigating or bioindicating qualities. So I just want to say a bit more about air quality gardens, because there's, if you don't know, there's a bit of a trend here to develop air quality gardens. On the one hand, to study the effects of air pollution on plants, and also as a kind of community gardening initiative. So one garden that I've looked at and also have discussed with the Zoetics work is this garden from NASA. And you wouldn't ordinarily think that the space agency would be developing air pollution gardens, but NASA has developed, the Langley Research Center has developed an ozone bioindicator garden project. And this is one of the first ways I was sort of also thinking about how to create an air quality garden. And here they're looking specifically at ozone injury and how plants are injured by the presence of ozone, or how they might proliferate when ozone is not present. So here you can see the typical plants they're working with, which are milkweed, coneflower, and snap beans. And they also provide instructions on their website for establishing your own ozone garden, ways in which you would stock, insulate, water, and label plants, and how you would also develop a methodical and standardized approach to cultivation, and then understand whether ozone is present or not, and how the plants are suffering from that, including signs of stippling or purple leaves, which you could photo document and then create a kind of, I guess, toolkit of sorts to see how ozone is present or not. So I think bioindication is a really interesting way in which to think about plants as sensors, and not just plants themselves as sensors, if we think also about lichens, but also about the relationships that are basically being affected by pollution. So it's not just the leaves of plants that are changing in color, it's also the different kinds of relationships that are falling away, for instance, with biodiversity. So in a kind of theoretical register, this is a way of attending to how environmental subjects form. How subjects form as environmental subjects, I should say, in the first case, but then also how they form through the lived effects of pollution and other environmental events. And this is work that I developed in a much more theoretical register in Program Earth, where I talk about the work of Alfred North Whitehead, who says there's no subject without its world. All subjects come along with superjects, is the term he used. He has these curious neologisms, particular terms he uses to talk about potentially quite new concepts that allow us to think about subjects differently. So in that sense, we could think about all of the different organisms within a swamp, for instance, or within an air quality garden as kind of multi-species world-making projects. I also draw here on work of feminist technoscience from thinkers like Anna Singh, if you read her new book, Mushrooming of the World, where she talks about how particular entities and worlds and relations are made through these mushrooms, through these practices of cultivating or harvesting mushrooms, and how we could think about that as also a time-making project, where organisms enlist each other and coordinate in making landscapes. So that's a quote from her. So these are not just worlds in the making through the activities of more than humans, but they're also informing the possibilities for livelihoods and new entities to arise. So that's a particular way of reading bioindication, not just as a kind of signaling mechanism, but as something that indicates our multiple affiliations in environments. So we could think about pollution in this respect as a kind of conflict that's taking place in the environment as well, that we could tune into, and how that might allow us to think about doing environments differently. So it's not just a kind of descriptive practice, but it's also a generative practice. And I wanted to pick up on some of the things that Gabrys was saying as well about decolonizing architecture and decolonizing the swamp. Because I think one of the things that bioindication does as a speculative practice is give rise to ways of thinking about experimental practices that take lead from conventional ways of understanding architecture and spatial practice. In part, we could say that this is due to the intrusion of Gaia, as Isabel Stenger says. We're in a moment of planetary distress, but also through thinking about different kinds of collective potential that might form through these different kinds of environmental subjects. So, as Kim Tallbear says, if we were to think about how to indigenize science and indigenize these modes of practice, this would include extending non-human beings that we're in relation with, as well as thinking about how to put the subject in the world, as it were. So she suggests to indigenize is to always bring the environment into consideration. And as Jennifer Wenzel suggests in her reading of Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, quote, decolonization demands not only a new humanity and humanism, but also a new materialism and political ecology, a shift in the valuation and disposition of nature, end quote. So this kind of decolonizing is not sort of simply something that we do as detached human subjects. It kind of completely remakes, as we've heard also through multiple other presentations, it remakes the entities that we're involved with, but it also places us in worlds in a different way. And I think we've heard about how to let the swamp kind of enter us, as it were. So I'm very much working in that modality as well when thinking about the kind of environmental subjects that we might become, in this case, in making an air quality garden. So I'm going to then just sort of walk you through what we did in the process of setting up this air quality garden, and then also making the Phyto-Sensor toolkit. So I wasn't the actual designer for the garden. There was a landscape architect who's working as a full-time sort of maker of gardens and more, who was brought on, Paul McGuinness, to actually make the structure. So I just advised on plants for this particular part. But the Museum of London then had in place 2 demonstrator gardens as part of their City Now, City Future exhibition. One at the entrance to the museum, which we placed dust boxes in, and then one slightly farther off onto the podium where there were a whole host of other plants here. But as I mentioned, there's also a number of community projects underway. So this is very much in the context of a community project here to create an air pollution garden at the edge of the Barbican estate. And there were other gardens as well, and just some window boxes and horse troughs from sort of 18th century for watering animals and so on. So this is very much an area that was proliferating with air quality gardens as we developed this demonstrator garden. So then the second stage was to develop a workshop and walk, where people would come along and test the Phyto-Sensor kit in its sort of beta stage, as we were developing a set of plants, really. If you take a look at it's now in the form of a booklet, but we had a number of plants that either have bioindicating or mitigating characteristics, as well as a map for a walk, and a number of places where people could record their observations, as well as their propositions for what a Phyto-Sensor toolkit might involve, so that they could also use this toolkit to create their own air quality gardens in London or farther afield. So I should say that this particular day was March 17th, and I don't think the museum expected that it would be -7 with wind chill, but we had a mini beast from the east, and people aren't as well acclimated to cold weather necessarily in London. Speaking to Lithuanians, I don't know, actually that doesn't sound that cold.
No.
So we didn't know whether we'd actually set off on this walk, but people came along basically in snowmobile suits, and they were determined to go out in the weather, so they were very insistent that we go around and look at these gardens. And basically what we did was a tour of the different air quality gardens in the area, including the demonstrator plots that we had set up. You can see that not all the plants, again, are sort of flowering, but we have things like yarrow here. And we were walking really around the Barbican, where many of the gardens are, and looking at these green spaces in relation to air pollution levels. And here you can see we're going down to the Beach Street monitoring station, which is there, which is where the dust box is. You can sort of see the blue cord. And we did find that this space, which is quite enclosed and hard space with lots of concrete and then cars going through, had quite high air pollution levels, with particulate matter coming specifically from the tunnel, because we're able to look at the wind direction from where the pollution is coming from with our data analysis tool. And you can see that nitrogen dioxide was particularly coming from the intersection with Barbican Station. So we were investigating these sites. We were looking at how the urban architecture informs the experience of and the levels of air pollution, as well as whether and how plants, such as these euphorbias here, would potentially create a haven or a refuge from air pollution. And I should say just briefly that part of this objective was really based on research findings we found from our dust box monitoring before, where we found that the lowest levels of air pollution in our monitoring network were in an enclosed garden in southeast London on a pedestrian street. So this sort of kicked off looking at how to create air quality gardens in that case. So here you can see with the Landseers, this hairy sort of captures particulates, part of a whole initiative, Clean Green for 17, the community group called it, where they were creating these green spaces. And here you can see again the community garden where they actually had materials donated from one of the construction companies, because central London is constant construction, and use those to create this space. Here you can see the gardener, Paul, pointing out Mexican orange blossom. It's not a plant I was familiar with, and also pointing people out to the various plants along the way. So our final stop on the walk was this BARBERS Physic Garden, and this is a historic site, which was kind of also an interesting reference point for thinking about this entanglement of plants and health. This is a site developed by Jean Girard, among others. He's a sort of famous botanist from the 17th century, and he wrote what many people might know as the Herbal. So this is in the site of sort of ruins from bombing damage, both Victorian and Roman walls, and the garden is at the back there. And so we investigated this kind of relationship between plants and health, and kind of thinking about plants in a curative way, how they might help to mitigate environmental problems as health problems. So from that, we developed this Phyto-Sensor toolkit, which we tested in the workshop. We gathered people's observations and thoughts about how to develop this, and then put it together into this booklet you see here today, which you're free to take. This box is just the more finished version. I didn't bring many of these because they got quite smashed along the way, but they have the Phyto-Sensor booklet and the Citizen Sense booklet. But basically, it's a how-to guide for people who want to create their own air quality garden. So it outlines basically what are the key air pollutants. Here you can see, for instance, the filter from the Beach Street monitor with the particulates on it. So that black stuff gets into not only your lungs, but your blood and your brain in some cases, depending on how small the particulates are. And here's just some examples of the plants that we were suggesting. Of course, these are very particular to the UK in many cases, but they not only have the ability to mitigate air quality, but also potentially through phytoremediation, they can also take up pollutants from soils, and do this also through particular relation to other plants. So it's a way to begin to think about cultivating the swamp, I think, or cultivating our collective swamps, our urban swamps, our atmospheric swamps, and how to create potentially a kind of generative approach to working along with other organisms, such as Amelanchier here, the Markii here, or the Betula pendula, which the silver birch are particularly good for capturing pollutants. Other plants that are particularly good for green walls, and so on. So we also have some scenarios for how you might plant to capture pollution from street trees and green walls and so on, and how to go about doing that. So that toolkit is also available as a PDF on the Museum of London website, if you're interested to look for that or circulate it. And then recently on the solstice, which was also Clean Air Day in London, I don't know if that was in the UK, but it's also an international thing. This group tweeted, quite to my surprise, that they had actually taken up the toolkit and made their own air quality garden at the local primary school. And so there they are out actually in Wales, creating their own air quality garden. So it's a toolkit that people have already taken up and made their own air quality gardens in places as, from Wales and elsewhere. So I just want to end on that note in thinking about how we make speculative gardens for the Swampicene. I don't know if that was one of the scenes that you mentioned in your long list in the introduction. But I think, because I don't have much time here, so I'll just say that we could think about how to engage with multiple other organisms as the sentinels, as has variously been discussed. Not just plants, but for instance mussels, fungi, and more, to create what Eduardo Viveros de Castro has called a multinaturalism. So that's a way of thinking about how all entities have perspectives, in the way that persons have perspectives, and that those perspectives can be brought into account to create a kind of multinaturalism, where environmental subjects are all taking account of the world and forming experiences of the world, and this can be a way to think about how we cultivate other kinds of worlds. So this is something that I think is potentially quite complex and complicated terrain for thinking about cultivation, since it brings in these multiple forms of relationships, but also how we might encounter these gardens in the middle of things. So these aren't gardens that we necessarily approach as the work of agential human subjects controlling and mastering nature, as it were, but it's finding ourselves in the middle of environmental conditions along with other organisms, and then finding ways to basically create new worlds in those contexts. So that's something that the lichens, I think, really point us to, the fungi, as well as the air quality plants, in thinking about how we might decolonize our environmental relations. So I just should also say quickly that there was a whole host of people who contributed from the Museum of London, as well as the City of London, and contributors Sarah Garcin and Francesca Perona, who helped also with the design. So there's some Italian influence here. And the Phyto-Sensor Toolkit is available there, and some of the lichen work is actually coming up very soon, in a special issue third text on the wretched earth. So it's looking at post-colonial ecologies, and that's curated and edited by some colleagues of mine at Goldsmiths. So thanks very much.
So thank you so much. This is really very fascinating and super important work. I was wondering whether you know the work of this Brazilian artist called Alvarez, if I'm not mistaken. So she did an exhibition this last fall in New York City. Her whole project has been on studying the ballast. Do you know her work?
I do actually, because Shella Sheikh, my colleague, has organized an event on botanical conflicts, and she was a speaker at that. Yeah, so it's amazing work, but if you want to let people know about it.
Just to say, because I'm working on this, what I call the ontology of the trans individual, which is a way to rethink of individuality outside of the Western Eurocentric account of the individual as separate from the rest of the environment. So as a way to recover a sort of understanding of subjectivity which enables different types of philosophy to speak with one another. And I found their work, in particular, the very idea that we constantly walk over seeds, over plants. So she studied all the different layers of the New York, particularly the New York's different areas of Brooklyn and New York cities, and undid the way in which all the ballast that was transported from Europe to Africa and Latin America during slavery, but with the beginning of colonization, has actually been transporting seeds. So we tend to think of plants as these fixed organisms, which are in a way, because they do transform the environment, they do tend to, they need soil, right? But at the same time, we constantly also transport not only the wind, but ourselves. We are agents of the transportation, and in this sense, there's a way in which colonization, I find her work super interesting. Colonization itself, like she studied the different layers of the city. Like we literally in New York City, we walk over the seeds of colonization. So there are all kinds of plants which she has also retrieved. Some of them, we will never flourish, and we will keep walking over those seeds without knowing where they come from. But some of them actually flourish. So there are part of bedrooms where you find plants which are original from places in Africa, and nobody ever mentioned this. Right? So, and it's kind of interesting because, particularly now in New York City, we live in this moment where everything is about stopping borders, so you can't even bring an apple through the border control because that's bringing pollutant, or you get screened each time, making sure that you have nothing, no living organism that you're bringing from somewhere else. And that's just a screen for the fact that I think we actually, I've been thinking about the way we carry seeds under our shoes. So I don't know, I just thought that this would be something for, it's very much a contribution to put together the idea of colonization, indigenous epistemology, and the kind of work you're doing.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I think migration as a topic is a really interesting way to look at how different organisms and entities move and what the kind of political trajectories of that movement also include. I know in the States there's quite a kind of barrier to bringing anything in that's food, but I was interested here to see that there's an entire installation of bog plants in the courtyard here and there. So somehow there's been this kind of movement of a Lithuanian bog to Venice, and that hasn't created some problems for migration because, I guess, of the European Union. But would you have been able to do that project prior to the EU? So there's something kind of interesting about how that then allows that movement and when that movement's not allowed. And we've also looked briefly with this project at the movement of eels in the Atlantic, because they very much depend on the movements of ocean currents. And now with climate change, those ocean currents are changing, so the migration of eels are changing. So many organisms are also caught up in this space of changing global circulation, where because of climate change, we think about as another sort of form of capitalist colonialism, really, where it's remaking not just a nation, but an entire sort of planet, and that's also shifting ways in which migration happens.
I was wondering about the question of making air quality gardens, which it's very fascinating, and I really like the idea of collaborating with different forms, different kind of organisms in order to achieve something which actually we don't know yet. So I was wondering, actually, I was thinking all the time about the theory of Gilles Clément, and this the question of making a garden and kind of control the garden. In a way, I found it kind of antithetical to the ideas of Gilles Clément, of course, which is more about an uncontrolled form of nature that takes over residual human artifacts and abandoned areas. So I don't know, I think maybe it's an ambitious question or maybe it's just a very naive question, but how the possibility of making air quality gardens can actually go hand in hand with the idea of the third landscape.
Yeah, but I think that's a kind of interesting point, but I wonder with the idea of just letting nature take over, in a way reinforces those ideas of the human and the natural as sort of distinct entities, as it were. So I guess that's why I suggested, in a way, starting in the middle of things and within cities. This means starting in particular contexts where there's already this kind of atmospheric swarm of air pollution, and then creating gardens, not necessarily as an exercise of mastery, but seeing how then they are affected by air pollution or not. Some of the plants in the demonstrator garden were bioindicator plants, so they were affected by air pollution and they started to die. And so that just became part of the way that the garden developed over time. But other plants were flourishing for other reasons. So I don't think that's to necessarily say that then we have to go this, I don't know, speculative realist route and try to write ourselves, or this nihilist route and write ourselves out of the equation in terms of creators or makers, but to kind of reconsider what those experimental practices might consist of and what those relations might involve. So thinking about those collaboratively, rather than as a kind of erasure of the human.
Yeah, no, probably I just formulated badly because it's actually the theory of it's not about nature taking over, but it's nature contaminating human spaces. So I was really thinking about the possibility of collaboration between this contamination rather than So I was really interested in this idea of the air quality garden as a form of collaboration because there is this intentionality and there is I really don't see it also as a kind of form of mastering nature, but rather this exchange.
I have another question, but there's no other. Sorry, but this is so. It's too good of an occasion to ask this question. So, what do you think? Because you mentioned the Anthropocene, right? But at the same time, you've been showing the way, and the idea of the Anthropocene is a concept that has been introduced to say, okay, we live in a time where it's pretty clear human presence has modified the world up to a level where we are in a different era, so to speak. Now, you've been showing how actually plants have been doing the same thing, and the human interaction without the plants would not be there. So don't you think that your work actually lead us towards overcoming the very idea of the Anthropocene precisely because there's no anthropos, there's no human without plants, and perhaps the plants are even more human than the human, because we tend to, whenever there's a critique of humanism, there's generally a tendency to include animals or whatever looks like humans, and I find your work on lichens particularly inspiring because there's no humanistic temptation there, right? So it's clearly we're beyond humanism. So what do you think of the concept of the Anthropocene? Is that not also too humanistic in a way for your project?
Yeah, no, precisely. I think the Anthropocene is too humanistic as a concept. So it's not a term I tend to use, and it also has been critiqued quite a lot within feminist theory and also critical race theory as something that also assumes a kind of universal man as the anthropos. So if you've read the Jamaican philosopher Sylvia Wynter,
Right.
she says, well, we've been told that climate change is a human-induced problem, but is it really? Her point is not to query the science, it's to query what's meant by human. Because it's very particular kinds of humans living particular kinds of lifestyles that have created climate change. Most of the people in the world, who would also be considered humans, have not created that problem of climate change, but they'll suffer the effects of it. So, on many registers, Anthropocene really doesn't do the work that we need to do in thinking about how to live in this time of planetary distress and how to rethink ourselves as environmental subjects. and to do so in a way that also takes account of issues of social and environmental justice.
Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. Yeah, I had a question maybe a bit in a different way. I was just wondering, we've been discussing this idea of the difficulty of the issues we are dealing with, and maybe the idea of vocabulary or like words. And I think what I really enjoyed in your presentation is how you started from this, looking at sensors and how do we know in this technology, and then gradually working back in a way towards MOS and as the technology basically, or
Yeah, plants as technology.
equally, yeah. And I think language as a technology is also interesting. Like there's this book by How Forest Thing.
Yeah.
And a great part of this is about how certain indigenous nations have in their vocabulary many more ways to essentially describe signs from nature, as in signs from trees, signs from animals. And yeah, I'm just wondering whether this making a vocabulary for your project is a part of it, or whether you sort of think there might be a need for us to describe, what the signs that we receive from the sensors. I mean, do we even have the words to describe them and share them together?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question. I'm a fan of that book by Bardo Combs, but I'm also a little bit hesitant to fully adopt, say, a kind of semiotic approach to understanding environments, and I think that's probably because my first degree is in literature, and while I very much appreciate the kind of expressive capacity of language, I also feel that it can end up creating a kind of total system of understanding and control that doesn't take account of other registers of experience. So I guess the question of vocabulary and words, however, is important, and I would probably look to the work of Alfred North Whitehead in that respect, because it's a way of remaking and inventing new concepts. So I would say with the vocabulary, finding a way to use words that are operational and generative rather than declarative and descriptive only. So how do we inhabit words, but how is language more like a kind of poetics, which we've heard some discussion of. And that's why I'm not sure, not being a semiotician, but just being a little bit wary of the kind of codification of semiotics, whether we could even think about vocabulary as something that is not expressly a sort of human language, but operates in different ways. So if we were to take seriously what are signs and signaling, and I think he's doing that in a certain register, but how do we think outside of semiotics, maybe even to do that work? Then what would those vocabularies consist of, and how would it even remake the project that is language?
Yeah, exactly. I'm also totally unsure about this proposal that's I'm looking into, and I mean it could also be more not necessarily making something new, but I'm thinking about in Iceland, for example. It's a very obvious thing, but there are so many ways to describe the weather or natural phenomenon, because it's so much part of everyday life, and whereas maybe it's not the same thing in other countries or cities, where maybe have a more distanciated. We've had, I'm putting myself in this growing up in Paris, and so yes, maybe these words actually exist. That's what I'm thinking. Maybe just if you speak to people from other generations, they have maybe a closer way, maybe an understanding of this change in nature. So I guess my question is, I'm also asking myself, are we not sometimes also just trying to make new, new language or new science, which maybe we can collect from existing practices and knowledge, other forms of knowledge, which are maybe more folkloric.
Quite possibly. And I think in part those are languages and observations and experiences potentially that are being lost. But at the same time, I wonder with climate change and environmental change and pollution and so on, how much there potentially is a need to be able to describe and identify in order to address new environmental problems. And potentially there is a language that we need that we don't have in this sense. I mean, I'm always kind of surprised when talking to people about plants, how little they know about plants. And apparently 80% of the organisms on the earth are plants, if I remember that correctly. I mean, plants are really, that might be in terms of biomass, plants are really things that dominate the planet. It's a green planet, it's the name of the book. But if you ask someone the difference between a pine tree and a birch tree, they'll actually be at a loss often. So being able then to understand, to see the signs of climate change, for instance, is, you know, seems sort of like a high art. So maybe there are languages, but those languages are modes of observation and of taking account and experiencing. So I think seeing those languages is very much situated within those encounters would be one way, as well as drawing on past experiences.
Right, maybe on this note, maybe we should wrap up.
Yeah,
And
quite
thank you
over
very
time,
much.
okay.
Thank you very much, Jennifer.